Who here is familiar with the butterfly effect? Has anyone ever heard of that before? All right. In its simplest understanding, it is the idea that even the smallest change or movement can lead to a massive change or impact. So the theory suggests that the wind of a butterfly flapping its wings on one part of the world could cause a tornado on the other side of the world. So now there's no evidence that butterfly wings actually create tornadoes. There are some more concrete examples of this principle. Last week, India launched a rocket to the moon and became the 4th country to successfully land on it. A great deal of math is involved in getting this right. To give you a small taste of the math involved, here is a picture from 1961, when the US was attempting to be the first to land someone on the moon. Now, I don't understand a word of what that says. And the complexity of it was so much that if they were even out by the slightest degree, the entire mission would be a complete failure. In fact, if it was only 1 degree out on launch, you may not have noticed at the start, but by the time they should have been arriving at the moon, they would have found themselves 7,000 kilometres away. This is an example of the butterfly effect, where one small change can lead to a significant impact later. And our scripture today demonstrates another one of those events, where the faith of one family set into place God's grand plan for restoring all of creation. While Abram and Sarai are perhaps the most unlikely candidates for God to have chosen, this seems to be a common thought throughout the biblical narrative. Abram was living in a time and place where idol worship was the normal. As far as we know, Abram was not seeking God, but clearly God was seeking him. It was despite Abram's idol worship that God chose Abram to begin his plan. He chose Abram to be the man who will father the nation of Israel. Abram's wife, Sarai, was unable to bear children. And so while we often refer to this passage as God's call to Abram, we also need to recognise that Sarai was as much part of this calling as Abram. As it would be Sarai who would bear children, this promise was as much to her as it was for Abram. And so we find that God chose the idol worshipper and a woman who could not have children to birth a nation. You couldn't have found anyone more unlikely. And so we must ask ourselves, why didn't God choose someone else? As we look forward through the Bible at all those who God raised up when he needed them, we realise he never seemed to pick the best candidate by our standard. God chose Moses, a man who stuttered when he spoke, and yet God chose Moses to speak for all of the people of Israel. God chose Gideon, a man from the weakest tribe, from the least family in his tribe, and who was the least in his family. That is the man who God chose to lead an army, outnumbered 1 to 450, and led them to victory. God reveals himself through those who we wouldn't expect. So when we would look at what was achieved, no one would be able to say that it was Moses who led Israel out of Egypt. No one would say that it was Gideon who won the battle. And no one would say that Abram and Sarai birthed Israel. But they could only give that credit to God, the God who worked through them. They would all know that Israel was born because God made it so. God calls the most unlikely so that he can work through them to bring about his plan. That's why God chose Abram and Sarai. It is because they were willing to place all their faith in the God who called. When God called to Abram and said, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you," Abram went. He left all that he knew, all that he had, and he followed God to the place that was promised, which was nearly 2,500 kilometres away. They believed that God could do as he had promised, and that God would take them as they were and work through them to create a nation, out of which a blessing to all humankind would come. God took Abram, the idol worshipper, and Sarai, who was barren, and because they were willing to place their faith in God, God was willing to use them and transform them into the people he wanted and needed them to be. God saying to Abram and Sarai, "I want to take you and turn you into who I created you to be. I want to take the man from Ur and the woman who is barren and make you into the mother and father of Israel." Verses 2 and 3 say this: "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." God made 3 promises to Abram. Promises to take Abram and to transform him into something new. "I will make you into a nation. I will take your name and make it great. I will take you and use you to be a blessing to all the people of earth." Abram and Sarai were none of these things when God first called them. And it was only through Abram and Sarai's faith that God would be able to make them into something new. Abram and Sarai didn't just demonstrate faith in obedience, but they were willing to have faith and place who they were in God's hands, and to let him mould and transform them into the people he needed. They left their country, their people, and their families, and traded it in for God's new nation, God's new people. But they would only inherit those things if they were willing to give God what they already had. Back in Bendigo, we have a rather famous place, at least for us, called Bendigo Pottery. Now, I took many school trips throughout the years to this place, and pretty much if you ever went to someone's house in Bendigo for dinner or lunch, there was always Bendigo Pottery in their house. So we would go to school trips, and we often had a chance to make something ourselves. And so we would be given a spinning wheel and this lump of clay, and it looked nothing like the vases, bowls, mugs, or dishes that were for sale. And yet this is how they all started. So we would place our little lump of clay on the spinning wheel and begin to shape it. I was terrible, heads up, absolutely atrocious. So often I got left with what was a pretty wonky looking bowl. Actually, it probably didn't even work as a bowl, to be honest. And it wasn't going to work for what I needed. But that's what I did like about pottery. I was able just to squish it all back down and start again. And our lives are rather similar in that way. We can start out as a simple lump of clay, and as life goes on, we get shaped by those around us, by our careers, by our families, where we grew up, and all of the other circumstances that life throws our way. And we may not always come out looking like the best versions of ourselves. Maybe we're a little bit wonky, a little bit cracked, or maybe we don't look anything like a bowl at all. But when we place our faith in God and hand him our life, our wonky little bowl, He can make it into something new. He can take us and make us into the people he created us to be. We only need to have the faith to give our life, our whole life, to God. Just like Abram and Sarai, they had been shaped by where they lived. They'd been shaped by their family and by the circumstances that life threw them. And then God shows up and says, "But I will make you into." God is able to take what we are and transform us into what he needs. We only need the faith to let him. To be willing to place all that we are into the hands of God. And while life shapes us into one thing, when God requires something of us, it won't matter what we look like, because he can still use us. God took the man from Ur and made him the father of Israel. God took a woman who could not have children and made her the mother of Israel. God called them because they would place their faith in him. And because they placed their faith in him, God took them as they were and transformed them into the people he needed. And so I wonder whether you are willing to place that same faith in God, to give God all of who you are, your whole life, to have the faith to let God take it all and let him shape you into what he needs you to be, into who he created you to be. Our series is titled Walk by Faith. And as we follow Abram and Sarai's journey with God, I wonder if you've considered that we will also be taking a journey. Just as they were transformed in their walk with God, we too have that same opportunity. If we are willing, we could find ourselves at the end of this series changed and transformed also. What if today you made a decision to place your whole life in God's hand, faithfully trusting him with all that you are? And while you may not notice the difference today or tomorrow, it may become one of the most impactful moments of your life. Not just changing you, but your future generations to come and all of those around you. There is no limit to what God can do with even the smallest amount of faith. We don't need to be perfect to serve God's purpose. We don't even need to have the skills or abilities to do what God's asking of us. All we need to do, like Abram and Sarai, when God calls, regardless of what our lives might look like, have the faith to say yes and know that through our faith, God will work through us. Our God desires to work through you. He wants you to be a part of his plan. God's desire is that you let him work through you so that he can make you into who he needs. God doesn't need you to be perfect first. Instead, he will work simply through your faith, because that is all you need. Abram and Sarai didn't get it right all the time. And while they demonstrated great faith at the start when God called, no doubt we will hear about the doubts and questions that arose later through their journey. But regardless of their mistakes and sometimes shaky faith, God still made a way through it all. Even in our own lives, we can seem to hijack God's plan. That doesn't mean God won't use us anymore. Instead, he finds a way to redeem our mistake and reveal himself anyway. God works through our faith and not our own ability. That is why God doesn't require you to be perfect for his plan. You don't need to be good at or even enjoy public speaking for God to call you to the platform. You don't need to have a heart for overseas mission for God to call you into other nations. You don't even need to believe in God for him to call you to follow. All you need to do is respond when he does call, and to whatever he calls you to. Don't wait until you know how to do it. Don't wait for it to be more convenient for you. If you know that is God calling you, obey and have faith. Because it is through your faith that God will reveal himself to those around you. It is through that faith that God will fulfill his plan. And it is through that faith that God will take you and make you into who he created you to be. It is our faith that allows God to work through us so he can fulfill his plan for the world. We're at the beginning of a new journey, a journey through the life of Abram and Sarai. And whether you're 7 or 70, whether you don't believe in God or maybe you've believed all your life, the call stands. God calls for each of us every day to follow him. He calls us to a new place and to become something new. And so, just as Abram and Sarai were willing to step out in faith, I wonder if we are prepared to do the same this morning. That decision could be that one moment that changes the course of your life. Away from the path that we thought we should take, and instead towards God, who we intend and hope to become. God's desire is to work through us. And so he made a way so that can happen. And that is faith. When we are willing to place our lives faithfully into God's hands, there is nothing he cannot make and there is nothing he cannot do. Go as God's people, planted firmly in his love, watered by his word, and bearing the fruit of faith. Amen.